Hi, this is Guy Burgess. In this post, I want to continue developing the massively parallel peacebuilding idea that I introduced in an earlier post, and is the major focus on this of the second phase of the Conflict Frontiers seminar series. More specifically, in this post, I want to address an obvious question about what is the relationship between peacebuilding and democracy. In earlier posts, we've talked a lot about the importance of defending the pursuit of the democratic ideal and preventing society from sliding into autocracy, anocracy, or anarchy, or war. And to do that, a first key step is to reclaim the word peace. The sort of cute line is peace isn't too important to leave to hippies. And to a very sad but real degree, peaceniks have come to be seen as this sort of naive kumbaya approach to what is arguably one of the most critically important problems facing human society. And just think for a minute about the plight of people who live in societies that aren't at peace. Take Syria, for example, and I'm still haunted by an article I read very, very early on in the Syrian civil war from a woman who was arranging playgroups for her kids and saw her whole world disintegrate around her. And that was 4 years ago. Think how bad and how much destruction has gone on. Or take the problem of autocracy. This image, I think, illustrates more clearly than anything else I've seen of the terrible costs of living under an autocratic regime. This is taken from the International Space Station, and you see the Korean Peninsula at the lower right corner of the image, and China in the upper left corner, and the area in the middle with no lights on at night is North Korea. And that tells you a lot about just how bad autocracy can get. And then there's Anocracy. In the case of Venezuela, we had a very good student working for us for a number of years from Venezuela. And the stories she told about, the heartbreaking stories she told about the sort of collapse of her country, are perhaps illustrated with this image of the store that has nothing on its shelf. If you can't manage to provide the most basic necessities, something's wrong. And she told us about how you couldn't even get toilet paper. The term peacebuilding comes out of the Agenda for Peace, a document produced by the United Nations and Secretary General Boutros Ghali. It made a distinction between three critical terms. The first was peacemaking, the process of negotiating a ceasefire, an end of active violent hostilities, as this article describes with reference to the Colombian Civil War. The second phase is peacekeeping, where blue-helmeted peacekeepers come in and enforce a ceasefire agreement. The next phase, and the far more difficult challenge, is peace building, which is the continuing process of pushing societies away from war, autocracy, anocracy, and toward the democratic ideal with wise and equitable governance, the protection of basic human rights, and all of that. The Alliance for Peacebuilding has a webpage with lots of definitions that give you a sense of the way people think about this. But it's important to realize that there are two big components. One is the process of reconciling past conflicts and especially unrightable wrongs. And this requires a need to balance the goals of peace, that is the end of violence, justice, holding people accountable, truth telling, agreeing on a common history of what happened, and mercy and forgiveness for folks who were caught up in the conflict and committed terrible crimes. But it also requires a prospective view that imagines a future society that everyone, or at least most everyone, would find sufficiently attractive to enthusiastically pursue and to leave some of the crimes of the past behind. We also make a distinction in some of our articles between peace building and peace cultivating. Peace building sort of applies a central engineered plan, which is kind of a complicated approach, going back to the distinction between complicated and complex approaches to conflict, that somebody's got the plans and somebody's directing everything. In truth, it's much closer to peace cultivating, where you're trying to support a natural process and the natural growth of society. So you can think of things that way as well. The goal of all of this is something very close to what Kenneth Boulding called stable peace. We could add the word stable democratic peace, which is a society that is wisely and equitably governed in ways in which the possibility of violence and violent conflict is so remote that it doesn't enter into anyone's calculations. And that's really what peace is. It's not an end to conflict. Another way to think about this is what I call inverted Clausewitz. Now, Clausewitz is this Prussian general who's widely quoted as describing war as the continuation of diplomacy, that is, peaceful dispute resolution by other means. Peace, you can just define that by flipping Clausewitz around. Peace is the continuation of war. That's violent dispute resolution by other peaceful means. You still have all the conflicts. You just don't approach them violently. So Boulding had a continuum. At the one end, you had stable war, where war was all anybody ever knew and all anybody ever expected. The other end, you have stable peace, which is where the possibility of war is so remote that it doesn't enter into anyone's calculations. And then in the middle, you have unstable war and unstable peace. So it's a continuum from a war-torn society to a violence-limited society. In this context, peacemaking is something you do at the stable war end. As you move over, you're into peacekeeping and then peace building. But what you're trying to do with peace building really is to make an ideal democracy, or at least as close to an ideal democracy as possible. And Boulding observed that societies, and when he wrote this, which sadly is now in the 80s, societies seem to be on the march to an ever greater expansion of regions of stable peace. When Boulding originally wrote Stable Peace, he talked about it first emerging in Scandinavia, where the Scandinavian countries used to be at war with one another more or less constantly, and then they decided, no, we're not going to do that anymore. And then it had expanded to include Western Europe after World War II, the United States, Japan, Australia, and countries around the Pacific Rim. And then since the fall of the Soviet Union, it's expanded to include Russia and China and lots of other countries as well. I've highlighted India and Brazil, but there are certainly others that might make it on the list. Now, unfortunately, it seems like we're on the verge of backsliding away from this stable peace ideal democracy back towards something that is far less stable and far more dangerous. You have in the United States and Western Europe, and to a different degree in Russia and China, we thought that democracy was great and everything was going well, and we're discovering not so much. And what we have to do is to figure out what's going wrong and to put us back on the track of making democracy what it could be. There's also the Fragile States Index, which in addition to showing a lot of parts of the world that are in really tough shape, most notably in Central Africa and the Middle East, it also highlights just how much Western Europe and the United States have slipped. We're not at the real peaceful end of the Fragile States Index. And I should also remember or point out before we go too far that we make a big deal about how pursuing democracy is in a very real sense synonymous with the pursuit of peace. And you have to acknowledge that while democracies have within and between themselves been pretty peaceful since World War II, they've also been involved in a lot of violence in other parts of the world, and violence in which they are certainly not completely blameless. So we're a long way from having this ideal democracy that we want. We just got to get back on track, and one of the things to address is how we contribute to violence in other parts of the world. So the goal of massively parallel peacebuilding is simply to push things toward this stable peace end of the continuum by making democracy and peace as broadly attractive and workable as possible. And the truth is that it isn't proving very workable at the moment, and lots of people have good reasons for questioning how attractive it is. So this is a big challenge, but it's one that we've got to find some way to meet.